My job has never been exciting, and that was exactly why I chose it. I work for a regional infrastructure compliance agency, the kind of government contractor position where your greatest achievement is completing paperwork nobody will ever read. We verify that federal infrastructure dollars are being spent according to regulation. We check pipe diameters against permit applications. We confirm that streetlight installations match approved blueprints. We measure sidewalk widths against accessibility standards. We photograph drainage systems and compare them to engineering drawings filed decades ago. It is, by design, the most boring work imaginable, which is why the Coldwell assignment stood out immediately. The work order came through on a Tuesday afternoon in March. I remember because Tuesdays were normally reserved for reviewing highway rest stop compliance reports, and I had developed a comfortable rhythm with that particular brand of tedium. I would arrive at 8:30, make coffee, open the first file, check toilet fixture specifications against ADA requirements, note minor violations, recommend corrective actions, move to the next file. By noon, I would have processed 6 facilities. By 4 o'clock, 12. The work was methodical, predictable, and required exactly 0 creative thinking. But this order was different. It was marked Priority Level 3, which I had never actually seen used in my 4 years with the agency. Priority 1 was reserved for active emergencies like water main breaks or bridge failures. Priority 2 for urgent safety issues that required immediate response. Priority 3 existed in our manual, but had always seemed theoretical, the kind of category created by committees that wanted comprehensive classification systems, but never expected certain classifications to actually be used. The order was simple: proceed to Coldwell, Montana, and verify infrastructure status for a town marked as temporarily uninhabited in the federal database. The specific task was to confirm that automated systems were functioning correctly and that no unauthorized usage was occurring. Estimated time on site, 2 days maximum. Per diem approved. Mileage reimbursement standard. Hotel accommodations to be arranged locally, if available. Otherwise, expense receipts accepted for reasonable lodging alternatives. I looked up Coldwell immediately. It appeared on Google Maps without issue. A small dot along Highway 41, roughly 60 miles from any major population centre. Street view was unavailable, showing only the standard grey silhouette icon, indicating that Google's camera cars had not yet mapped the location. But satellite imagery showed a completely ordinary rural American town. Grid-pattern streets radiating from a central main street, residential neighbourhoods with tree-lined blocks, a main street with commercial buildings, a water tower bearing the town name, a school complex, a park with what appeared to be sports fields. Everything you would expect from a community that had existed for over a century. The population, according to every source I could find, was listed as 0. Not uninhabited, not abandoned, not evacuated, 0. As if the town existed but had never contained people at all. As if the buildings and streets and infrastructure had materialized spontaneously without human purpose or occupation. I checked multiple sources to confirm this was not a simple data error. Wikipedia, 0. Census.gov, no data available. City-data.com, 0. Even commercial real estate sites that list population for market analysis purposes showed 0 population, with a note that data might be outdated or incomplete. I brought the discrepancy to my supervisor, a man named Gerald Voss, who had worked in regulatory compliance for 23 years and treated every question as if it were an accusation of incompetence. Is this a ghost town situation? I asked, standing in his office doorway. Because the assignment says temporarily uninhabited, but all the data shows zero population, going back decades. Gerald did not look up from his computer screen, where he appeared to be reviewing a spreadsheet with the kind of intense focus usually reserved for classified intelligence rather than infrastructure budgets. The assignment is clear. Verify infrastructure. File report. 2 days maximum. But if nobody lives there, why are we maintaining infrastructure? We maintain infrastructure in many locations with minimal occupation. Fire lookout stations, weather monitoring facilities, emergency shelters, National Park Service facilities, border patrol stations in remote areas. The why is not your concern. The compliance verification is. But the records show what they show, Gerald interrupted, finally making eye contact. His expression was not hostile, just tired. The look of someone who had learned that questions only create additional work, and additional work only creates additional questions. Your job is to verify physical infrastructure against reported specifications, not to audit census data, not to investigate historical population trends, not to question federal land use policy. Is that clear? It was clear. It was also completely unsatisfying. I just want to understand what I'm walking into, I said. You're walking into a standard infrastructure verification assignment. 2 days, in and out, simple as that. I left for Coldwell the following Monday, driving my own vehicle because the agency had exactly 3 fleet cars, and all were perpetually in use by people with more seniority. The drive took just under 7 hours, most of it through landscape that shifted from agricultural to high desert to something in between. Montana in early spring is all mud and grey skies, the kind of environment that makes you understand why people describe places as unforgiving. I left at dawn, watching the city dissolve into suburbs, then exurbs, then open country. The transition was gradual but absolute. Within 2 hours of leaving my apartment, I had entered a landscape where human presence was measured in fence lines and distant buildings rather than continuous habitation. Power lines marked the only consistent evidence of civilization, stretching across empty miles like stitches holding together fabric that wanted to tear apart. Highway 41 was well maintained but empty. I passed perhaps a dozen vehicles the entire drive. A semi-truck hauling timber, a pickup with out-of-state plates, a minivan with camping gear strapped to the roof. Each vehicle appeared briefly in my mirrors and then vanished, consumed by distance. No towns appeared for the final 90 minutes of travel. Just road, fence lines, and distant mountains that never seemed to get closer, no matter how long I drove toward them. The radio lost signal after the first hour. I tried scanning for stations and found only static with occasional fragments of sound. A few words of talk radio, a burst of country music, a weather report for counties I had never heard of. Then static again. Eventually I gave up and drove in silence, watching the landscape repeat itself in subtle variations. Grassland, rocky outcrop, creek bed, grassland again. The turn-off for Coldwell was marked with a standard green highway sign. Population, blank, elevation, 4,200 feet. The number for population had clearly been removed, leaving only the faint outline where adhesive-backed digits had once been attached. The ghost of a number. The memory of people who were no longer counted. The road into town was freshly paved. That was the first thing that struck me as wrong. Not cracked, not patched with the characteristic dark squares that mark aging infrastructure. Completely, recently repaved, with clean yellow centre lines and bright white edge markers. The kind of road maintenance that suggested regular use and appropriate budget allocation. The kind of maintenance you only see on roads that carry significant traffic, roads that justify the expense of complete resurfacing rather than piecemeal repair. For a town where nobody lived. Chapter 2. A town that functions without people. Coldwell appeared gradually, the way rural towns do. First a scattered house, set back from the road, then another, a quarter-mile further. Then suddenly you're on Main Street, without quite noticing the transition. No city limit sign, no welcome marker. Just the subtle shift from open land to clustered buildings that marks the boundary between wilderness and civilization. The buildings were intact, not pristine but maintained. Paint was faded but not peeling. Roofs showed age but no visible damage. Windows were clean enough to reflect the overcast sky. Lawns were trimmed, though not recently enough to show the sharp edges of fresh mowing. Everything existed in a state of careful preservation, like a museum exhibit of small-town America, maintained at precisely the point before decay becomes obvious. I parked in front of what appeared to be the town hall, a brick building with white columns that would have looked important in a town of 5,000 but seemed absurdly grand for a place with zero population. The architecture was early 20th century, the kind of civic building constructed during an era when towns believed they would grow forever, when optimism was built into foundations and expressed through unnecessary grandeur. The parking spaces were clearly marked, fresh paint on asphalt that was slightly warm under the afternoon sun. The sidewalk was swept clean of debris. A flagpole held an American flag that moved slightly in the wind, the fabric making that distinctive snapping sound that flags make when air pressure differentials create momentary tension. Everything was exactly as it should be, except for the complete absence of people. I got out of my car. The air was cold and thin at this elevation, and my breath was visible. I could hear the wind moving through power lines, making them hum with a low frequency that you feel in your chest more than hear with your ears. The flag chain tapped against the pole with metronomic regularity. My own footsteps on pavement. Nothing else. No traffic sounds, no voices, no dogs barking, no distant radio or television bleeding through open windows, no machinery running, no children playing, no doors opening or closing, just wind and the sound of my own presence, which suddenly felt intrusive, as if I were trespassing in a space that had been carefully prepared for something that was not me. I walked down Main Street slowly, taking in details. Every building was locked but appeared functional. A hardware store with window displays still arranged in neat rows, hammers hung on pegboard, paint cans stacked in pyramids, garden hoses coiled on display racks, a diner with menus visible inside the door, plastic-coated pages showing breakfast specials and sandwich combinations, a post office with hours of operation posted on the door, Monday through Friday, 8 to 5, Saturday, 8 to noon. A bank with an ATM that showed a blue screen indicating it was active and ready to accept transactions. The streetlights were functional. I could see the photo cells mounted on each fixture that would activate them at dusk. The traffic light at the main intersection cycled through its normal pattern, even with no traffic to direct. Green, yellow, red, green again, 20-second intervals. An automated system performing its function for an audience of nobody, following programming that assumed rush hours and school zones and human schedules that no longer existed here. I tried the door of the diner, locked as expected. I cupped my hands against the glass and peered inside, pressing my forehead to the cool surface to block glare. Tables were set with paper placemats, salt and pepper shakers in place. The glass kind with metal tops that you see in diners that have been operating since the 50s. Sugar packets arranged in small metal holders, napkin dispensers full, a chalkboard menu behind the counter listed daily specials in neat handwriting. The letters formed with the practiced uniformity of someone who had written the same words hundreds of times. Chicken fried steak with mashed potatoes, meatloaf with green beans, lemon meringue pie. The last item made me step back from the window. Lemon meringue pie requires fresh preparation. The meringue alone would not last more than a day or two before breaking down, weeping liquid and collapsing into a sticky mess. This suggested either the menu had not been updated in years, written once and left unchanged as permanent decoration, or something far stranger. Someone had written this menu recently enough to believe the pie would be available. Someone had planned for customers who never arrived. I moved to the residential areas, following streets that bore names like maple and oak and cedar, the generic tree names that town planners assign to give character to grid patterns. Street after street of houses, all maintained, all empty. Lawns mowed but not recently, the grass perhaps 3 inches tall, just at the point where mowing becomes advisable, but not yet necessary. Curtains visible in windows, suggesting furnished interiors. Porch furniture arranged in normal configurations, chairs facing the street, small tables positioned for coffee cups, welcome mats centered at doorways. Mailboxes stood open and empty, their little red flags in the down position. I checked several. No mail inside, no accumulated junk flyers or misdelivered letters, just empty metal containers waiting for delivery that would never come. One house had a garden with early spring growth visible even from the street. Daffodils pushing through soil, their green shoots indicating recent biological activity. Bulbs that had been planted months ago in the fall by someone who expected to see them bloom in spring. Plants that had been tended within the past growing season, watered and weeded and cared for, then abandoned at exactly the right stage to survive winter and emerge in their proper time. I checked the water system next, following my actual assignment rather than my growing curiosity. A public access point near the park provided a test location. I turned the handle on a drinking fountain, and water flowed immediately. Good pressure, clear and cold. I let it run for 30 seconds, watching for discoloration or sediment. Nothing. I held my hand under the stream and felt the temperature. Cold enough to numb fingers within seconds. I smelled the water. Chlorine scent clearly detectable, indicating treatment. Somewhere, a water treatment facility was operating at full capacity, processing and distributing clean water to a distribution system that served empty buildings. The electrical system was equally functional. I walked to the nearest transformer and stood beneath it, listening. The characteristic 60-cycle hum of alternating current was clearly audible. Active load. Somewhere in this town, electricity was being consumed in quantities significant enough to require transformer capacity beyond simple maintenance of the grid itself. Power lines showed no visible damage, no broken insulators, no downed conductors, no vegetation encroachment that would indicate neglect of right-of-way maintenance. I checked the meter on the town hall, locating the grey box mounted on the building's exterior wall. The digital display showed current draw, 0.73 kilowatts. Not much, but also not nothing. Something inside was consuming electricity at a steady rate. HVAC system, probably. Maybe security lighting. Maybe computers left in standby mode. Maybe something else entirely. I tried the front door of the town hall, locked as expected, but the handle was recently oiled. I could feel the smooth action, no rust or stiffness. It turned easily through its full range of motion, the internal mechanism operating as if it had been serviced within the past month. Maintenance that suggested regular use, or at least regular inspection. I walked the perimeter of the building, checking other access points. Side door, locked, well maintained. Back door, also locked, but less pristine. The handle showed slight oxidation, suggesting this entrance was used less frequently. Loading dock with a rolling door, secured but operational, the tracks clean and properly aligned. Everything in Coldwell worked, every system functioned, every element of municipal infrastructure operated at designed capacity, serving a population of 0 with the same efficiency it had presumably served hundreds of residents decades earlier. Chapter 3. Signs of recent presence. I broke into nothing. Let me be absolutely clear about that. I was conducting an authorised infrastructure inspection, and when I found the town hall's back door unlocked during my second perimeter check, I simply performed my assigned duty by entering and verifying interior systems. That is what I told myself as I turned the handle and felt it move freely as I pushed the door open and stepped into a building that should have been secured. As I found evidence that made my assignment feel suddenly less routine and far more disturbing, the interior was clean. Not dusty, not abandoned, not marked by the kind of decay that accumulates in unoccupied buildings. The floors had been swept recently enough that my footprints were visible in the slight film of settling dust, but this was the kind of dust that accumulates in a day or two, not weeks or months. The kind of dust that exists even in occupied buildings between cleaning sessions. The microscopic particles that drift through air and settle on horizontal surfaces despite our best efforts at perfect cleanliness. The air inside was stale but not old. It smelled of closed spaces and cleaning products. Pine sol specifically, that distinctive, sharp scent that suggests recent mopping, a scent that does not last more than a few days after application, before fading into background odours. Someone had cleaned this floor within the past week. Someone had mopped these hallways, emptied these trash cans, wiped down these surfaces. I walked through the town hall, slowly, my footsteps echoing in empty corridors. Offices were furnished and organised. Desks held computers that were powered down, but not disconnected. Their monitors dark, but their power lights showing amber standby indicators. Keyboards were centered on desk surfaces. Mousepads were positioned correctly. File cabinets lined walls, their drawers labelled with neat handwritten cards indicating contents, property records, tax files, utility accounts, council minutes. I tried one file cabinet, locked. I tried another, also locked. Professional locks, not simple catches. Someone valued the security of these records enough to ensure they remained protected even in an abandoned building. Bulletin boards displayed notices dated from the previous calendar year. A community meeting about water rate increases scheduled for March 17th. A notice about road construction on Cedar Street planned for April. A flyer for a 4th of July celebration, promising fireworks, pie contest, and live music. Events that had never occurred, or had occurred for an audience of nobody, or had been scheduled with the expectation that someone would attend before plans changed and the town emptied without explanation. In the main meeting room, chairs were arranged in neat rows, facing a podium positioned at the front of the room. Exactly 12 rows of 6 chairs each, creating a capacity of 72 seats, a number that suggested expectations of modest attendance. A projector hung from the ceiling on a professional mount. The screen was lowered and ready for use, showing a slight sag in the middle that indicated weight settling over time. Everything prepared for a meeting that would never happen, maintained by someone for reasons I could not yet understand. I found the thermostat mounted on a wall in the main hallway. It was set to 55 degrees Fahrenheit, economy heating mode, just warm enough to prevent pipe damage during cold Montana winters, but not comfortable for human occupation. Yet when I examined the programming, pressing the menu button and scrolling through settings, I found a schedule clearly configured for human presence. 68 degrees from 8 in the morning until 5 in the evening. 55 degrees from 5 in the evening until 8 in the morning. Weekend settings different from weekdays. A pattern that suggested expected human presence during business hours, with automated reduction during nights and weekends to conserve energy when the building would presumably be empty. Except the building was always empty now. The schedule served no purpose except to maintain the appearance of normalcy. In the back office, I found something that made me stop moving entirely. My hand frozen in mid-reach. A coffee mug sat on a desk. White ceramic with a logo for a bank that I recognized as regional but not local. I touched it without thinking, my fingers making contact before my brain could question whether this was wise. The ceramic was slightly warm, not hot, not cold, warm enough to register distinctly against my fingertips, which had grown cold in the 55-degree building. Warm in a way that suggested coffee had been inside it within the past few hours. Liquid hot enough to transfer heat to ceramic, thick enough to retain that heat for a limited time after being emptied. I pulled my hand back as if the mug might burn me. I looked around the office, suddenly hyper-aware of my surroundings, searching for other signs of recent presence. The desk was organised. Papers were stacked neatly. A pen lay precisely parallel to the desk edge. A keyboard showed no dust on its keys, unlike the visible film on the desk surface around it, suggesting the keyboard had been used recently enough to prevent accumulation. I checked the coffee maker in the small break room adjacent to the office. The carafe was empty, clean, no coffee grounds in the filter basket, no water in the reservoir. But when I touched the heating plate with the back of my hand, holding it close without making contact, I could feel residual warmth, not hot enough to burn, not cold like it should have been. Warm enough to indicate recent use, within the past hour or two at most. Someone had been here. Recently. Very recently. Possibly within the past 60 minutes. Possibly while I had been walking around outside examining water systems and electrical infrastructure, completely unaware that I was not alone. I left the building quickly, forcing myself not to run but moving faster than walking, taking stairs 2 at a time, pushing through the back door into cold mountain air that suddenly felt safer than the interior of a building that should have been empty but clearly was not. Outside, the afternoon light seemed brighter after the dim interior. I walked back to my car, suddenly aware of how exposed I was in the middle of an empty street. How visible, how vulnerable. I got in the vehicle and locked the doors, then immediately felt foolish for this action. If someone meant me harm, car door locks would provide minimal protection. If someone meant me harm, I was already in an ideal location for harm to occur without witnesses or intervention. But nobody approached, no doors opened, no vehicles appeared. The town remained exactly as empty as it had been when I arrived. I drove to the residential area and parked on a different street, trying to create unpredictability in my movements, making myself harder to track if anyone was indeed tracking me. I got out again and walked the neighbourhood, this time looking specifically for evidence of recent human activity rather than general infrastructure condition. And I found it everywhere once I knew what to look for. Tyre marks on pavement that was slightly warmer than surrounding asphalt. When I knelt and touched it with my palm, friction heat from a rubber on concrete had not yet fully dissipated. Something had driven this street within the past few hours, and the thermal signature remained detectable. The marks were not from my own vehicle, different tyre pattern, wider wheelbase, something larger than my compact sedan. A door that had been opened within the past day, evident from the displaced dirt pattern at its base. The door had swept an arc through settled dust and dirt, creating a clean semicircle where wood had brushed ground. But new dust and debris had not yet filled the clearing completely. This was recent displacement within 24 hours at most. Inside a storefront window, a newspaper stood in a metal rack, the kind of community paper dispensers that used to be common before digital media made printed news obsolete in most places. I could not read the date from outside through the glare on the glass, but the paper was crisp and white, not yellowed, not brittle, not marked by the aging that affects newsprint within weeks of publication. Either this paper was remarkably well preserved, protected from light and air by conditions that would be difficult to maintain accidentally, or it was recent enough that aging had not yet begun. The most disturbing detail was also the subtlest. I noticed it only because I had worked enough infrastructure inspections to recognize patterns in maintenance, to understand how systems degrade and how human intervention prevents that degradation. On every street, on every block, there were slight variations in how things were maintained. One section of sidewalk was cleaner than another. One lawn was trimmed more recently. One building's windows were clearer. One stretch of street had fresher paint on curbs. The pattern suggested rotation, a systematic approach, as if someone was maintaining the town in sections, keeping everything functional, but never quite perfect everywhere at once. The kind of maintenance schedule you would use if you had limited resources and wanted to preserve the appearance of normalcy without the manpower for comprehensive upkeep. A schedule that suggested regular presence but not constant occupation. A schedule that suggested something monitoring and maintaining but not living here in any conventional sense. I walked for 2 more hours as afternoon faded toward evening, documenting everything with my phone camera. Pictures of tyre marks, pictures of swept doorways, pictures of street lights beginning to activate as photocells detected diminishing daylight, pictures of a town that functioned perfectly despite having nobody to function for. As dusk approached, I made a decision. I would stay the night. Not in a hotel, because there did not appear to be an operating hotel, despite several buildings that had clearly once served that purpose. I would stay in my car, parked where I could observe, where I could watch for whoever was maintaining this place, where I could possibly understand what Coldwell actually was. Chapter 4. The Missing Records. I spent the first night in my car, parked in the lot of what I had identified as the town motel, a single-storey building with a row of doors facing the parking area and a small office on the end marked by a neon sign that was not illuminated. The building was locked, but through the office window I could see a completely normal check-in counter with a bell for service, a key rack on the wall with room numbers, and a computer terminal that glowed faintly with standby power, its screen showing a blue sleep mode shimmer in the darkness. I did not sleep well. Every small sound seemed amplified in the silence of the empty town. Wind against metal siding, the building settling as temperatures dropped, the distant hum of electrical systems running in empty buildings, maintaining climate control for rooms that would never be occupied. I kept expecting to hear footsteps, or voices or engines. I heard nothing but wind and my own breathing, and the occasional creak of my car's cooling engine. At one point, around 2 a.m, I thought I saw movement in my peripheral vision, a shadow passing between buildings, perhaps a block away. But when I sat up and looked directly at the location, there was nothing. Just empty street and the orange glow of sodium vapor street lights, creating pools of illumination separated by darkness. At dawn, I drove to the library, a small brick building adjacent to the town hall. The exterior was well maintained, with recent pointing visible in the mortar between bricks, suggesting professional masonry work within the past few years. The door was unlocked, which surprised me until I realised that in a town with no population, security becomes irrelevant. Who would you be securing against? The interior smelled of old paper and furniture polish, and the lights were already on when I entered, which meant they were either on a timer or had never been turned off. The library was exactly what you would expect in a small rural town. Fiction organised alphabetically, non-fiction using Dewey Decimal, a children's section with low shelves and colourful displays, a reference desk with a computer terminal and a stack of due date cards that would never be used. I went straight to the local history section, following the logic that if Coldwell had once been inhabited, there would be records, newspapers, yearbooks, property records, high school annuals, historical society publications, something to explain how a functional town had arrived at zero population without leaving traces of departure. I found the newspapers first, the Coldwell Chronicle, published weekly. The archives went back to 1928, bound volumes occupying an entire shelf section. I started with recent years and worked backward, looking for the inflection point, the moment when population zero became the reality instead of a clerical error. 2015. Typical small-town content. High school sports scores reported with enthusiasm disproportionate to their actual significance. Football games described in detail despite involving only a dozen players per side. Town council meetings summarised with attention to debates about snow removal budgets and parking regulations. A dispute over whether the town should invest in new playground equipment or repave the school parking lot. Population mentioned in an article about school enrolment. 472 students across grades K through 12. 2010, similar content. A celebration of the town's centennial, complete with parade photos and historical retrospectives. Articles about founding families and original buildings. Interviews with oldest residents remembering earlier times. Population noted in anniversary article 489, with a footnote explaining this number represented a modest decline from peak population of 612 in 1980. 2005, road construction updates dominating several issues. Highway 41 being widened and improved. New stop sign installed at Cedar and Main. Debate about whether this represented progress or unnecessary government intervention in local affairs. Population mentioned in census article 493, described as stable and sustainable for the community's economic base. Then I reached 2000. The content changed in a way that was subtle but unmistakable once you noticed it. Articles stopped mentioning residents by name. Sports coverage continued, but without identifying which students played which positions. Stories about town council meetings summarised decisions, but did not quote specific council members. School news reported events, but did not list student participants. It was as if the newspaper had continued publishing, but had lost access to the actual people it was covering, forced to describe community life in generic terms because specific details were no longer available. I read more carefully, looking for explanation. I found none. The transition was gradual, occurring over a period of 18 months, names becoming less specific. Local residents expressed concern instead of John Williams told the council. Several students participated instead of names and grades. By 2002, the Chronicle had become a newspaper that reported on a community in purely abstract terms, as if describing a town that existed only in theory. The final issue was dated December 26, 2003. The front page reported Christmas celebrations and New Year's preparations. Generic content that could have been written for any small town in America. No names, no specific details, just the outline of community life described in language that implied presence without proving it. Then nothing. No issues for 2004, no announcement of closure, no explanation, just absence where weekly publication had existed for 75 years. I pulled census records next, moving to the reference section where official documents were stored in filing cabinets marked by decade. Caldwell appeared in every census from 1910 through 1990. Population fluctuated between 400 and 600 residents, normal variations for a rural town depending on agriculture and resource extraction. Good years and bad years, periods of growth when mining operations expanded, periods of decline when farms consolidated and mechanization reduced labor needs. 1990, population 547. Detailed breakdown by age, race, gender. Employment statistics showing heavy concentration in agriculture and service industries. Education levels typical for rural America. Income below state median but consistent with regional economics. 2000, population 493. Less detailed than previous censuses, but still comprehensive. Demographic breakdowns. Employment categories, housing occupancy rates, 2010, no entry, not zero, not data unavailable, just absent from the record entirely, as if the census taker had driven past Caldwell without stopping, as if the town had been removed from the list of places requiring enumeration. 2020, no entry, same absence, same silence. The town had been administratively erased from census records while maintaining every other bureaucratic function. Tax collection, utility service, postal designation, everything except population counting. I found property tax records next, stored in a different section of filing cabinets. These were more recent, updated annually, showing continuous payment through the present year. Every residential and commercial property in Caldwell had paid property taxes every year without interruption. The payments came through automated systems, bank drafts, and electronic transfers executed with perfect regularity. Never late, never contested, never requiring human intervention. But the names on the tax accounts were strange. I started cross-referencing them against phone directories, voter registrations, state driver's license databases accessible through public records requests I had filed previously for other projects. None of the names appeared anywhere else. The accounts were registered to people who seemed to exist only on Caldwell's tax rolls. No social security numbers matched to actual persons. No birth records corresponded to the names listed. No death records either. The properties were owned by ghosts, or more accurately, by entities that had been created purely for the purpose of maintaining the appearance of occupied property. Legal fictions that existed only on paper, paying taxes through automated systems funded by accounts that were themselves connected to nothing traceable. Birth records stopped in 1999. The last registered birth in Caldwell was a girl named Jennifer Marie Collins, born on December 18th of that year at Caldwell Community Hospital. Mother, Patricia Collins. Father, Robert Collins. Everything properly documented. Birth certificate filed with the state. Social security number assigned. Then nothing. No subsequent records for Jennifer Marie Collins. No school enrollment. No medical records after initial birth documentation. As if she and her family had simply vanished after her birth was officially recorded. Death records stopped in 2001. The last registered death was a man named Walter Harrison Gray, aged 73, who died of heart failure on March 6th. Funeral services held at Caldwell Methodist Church. Burial at Caldwell Cemetery. Everything properly documented. Death certificate filed with the state. Social Security death index updated. Then nothing. No more deaths recorded in Caldwell, as if mortality itself had stopped affecting this town, as if the population had achieved immortality, or more likely, had ceased to exist in any way that required death certificates. I found something else in the back of a filing cabinet marked Special Projects, Restricted Access. The lock had been defeated at some point, the mechanism broken, the drawer pulling open easily. Inside was a folder marked Relocation Study, Confidential. The contents were documents dated 1998 through 2000. They outlined a federal proposal to relocate Caldwell residents to a new planned community in eastern Montana. The reason given was infrastructure costs. Caldwell's remote location and aging systems made continued habitation economically non-viable. The study provided detailed cost-benefit analysis showing that relocation would be cheaper than continued maintenance of infrastructure serving such a small population. The proposal was comprehensive. Every resident would receive fair market value for property plus additional compensation for relocation expenses. Employment assistance would be provided. The new community would offer better schools, better healthcare access, better economic opportunities. Everything framed as improvement rather than displacement. Everything carefully designed to minimize resistance. But the study had a handwritten note on the final page, written in blue ink. Project discontinued per directive, dated May 22, 2000. Alternative approach approved. See Section 14 Addendum for implementation details. There was no Section 14 Addendum. I searched the entire folder. I checked adjacent folders. I looked in other filing cabinets. Nothing. The implementation details had been removed or had never been included. The alternative approach remained unexplained. Chapter 5. The first explanation that almost works. I called Gerald from the library using my cell phone. Service was surprisingly strong for such a remote location, showing 4 bars of signal strength, which suggested either a nearby cell tower or some kind of signal amplification system serving the area. He answered on the 3rd ring, his voice showing the flat affect of someone interrupted during routine work. I need clarification on the Caldwell assignment, I said, without preamble, without the usual pleasantries that normally precede business conversations. You're supposed to verify infrastructure. Have you done that? The infrastructure is functional. Too functional. Water, power, sewage, everything works perfectly. But Gerald, there's no population, not temporarily uninhabited. 0 population for at least 15 years, possibly longer. And it's not abandoned, it's actively maintained. Recently, I found evidence of presence within the past few hours. Silence on the line. Long enough that I checked my phone screen to confirm the call had not dropped. The timer continued counting. He was still there, just not responding. Gerald, complete your infrastructure verification. File your report. Return to the office. But the records show systematic population removal. Census data deleted. Birth and death records terminated. Property ownership transferred to entities that don't exist. This is not a simple abandoned town situation. "Are not your concern," he interrupted, his voice harder now, the flatness replaced with something more deliberate. "You were sent to verify infrastructure functionality. You've confirmed it's functional. Your assignment is complete. Anything beyond that scope is not your responsibility and not your business. Somebody is maintaining this town, actively, recently, today probably. Who's paying for that? Who's authorized to be here?" Another pause, shorter this time. I could hear him breathing, could hear the sound of him choosing his words carefully. There was a relocation program. Residents were compensated and moved to a planned community in eastern Montana. The town is maintained as a strategic reserve location, emergency housing capacity, disaster response staging area. It's not unusual. The federal government maintains several such locations across the country. This was the first explanation that made sense. Sort of. The federal government does maintain emergency housing in various forms: FEMA staging areas, disaster response capacity, strategic reserves for population displacement during catastrophic events. It was not insane to think they might maintain an entire empty town for such purposes. It was expensive, but not unprecedented. But the explanation had gaps large enough to drive trucks through. "Where's the documentation for the relocation?" I asked, keeping my voice level, professional, just asking for information rather than challenging his authority. "I found a study that was discontinued, no completion reports, no resident compensation records, no documentation of property transfers. And if this is emergency housing, why isn't that designation marked anywhere? Why is it listed as zero population instead of reserve capacity status? These are administrative details handled at levels above your clearance. Complete your assignment." My assignment was to verify infrastructure for a temporarily uninhabited location. If this is permanent reserve capacity, that's a different classification entirely. The assignment itself is based on incorrect parameters. I need to file under the correct category, or the report will be useless for compliance purposes. I heard Gerald exhale slowly, the sound of a man who was tired of this conversation, but also unable to simply dismiss the points being raised. Sometimes administrative classifications lag behind actual status. The important thing is that infrastructure is maintained and functional, which you've verified. So file your report using the parameters you were given and move on. There are 12 other assignments waiting for review. This one has taken enough of your time and enough of mine. "But Gerald, file your report. Return to the office. We'll discuss any concerns you have when you're back, not over the phone." He hung up. I sat in the library for a long time after that call, staring at my phone, replaying the conversation in my mind, analysing the careful phrasing, the places where Gerald had sounded scripted rather than spontaneous, the places where he had redirected rather than answered. The explanation was reasonable. Bureaucracies do operate with outdated classifications. Records do fall through gaps between agencies. Paperwork does get lost or misfiled. It was possible, even likely, that Coldwell was exactly what Gerald said. A relocated community maintained as emergency reserve capacity with some administrative documentation that had never been properly updated or centralised. It was a good explanation. It almost worked. It covered most of the anomalies. It provided a rational framework that did not require conspiracy or malice, just normal governmental incompetence and bureaucratic inertia. But it did not explain the warm coffee mug. It did not explain the rotation pattern of maintenance. It did not explain why, if this was strategic reserve housing clearly designated as such, it was not marked as such on any map or database. Strategic reserves are documented precisely because they need to be accessible in emergencies. You do not hide emergency resources. You catalogue them comprehensively so they can be deployed rapidly when needed. And it definitely did not explain what I found when I visited the cemetery. Chapter 6. The pattern beneath the town. I found Coldwell Cemetery by following the road that curved around the east edge of town, marked by a small sign that would be easy to miss if you were not looking for it. The cemetery occupied a hillside with a view of the valley, following the traditional pattern of placing the dead in elevated locations where they can metaphorically watch over the living. The cemetery was well maintained, grass was mowed, headstones were upright and clean. Flowers had been placed on some graves recently enough that they had not yet completely wilted, though they were faded and drooping in a way that suggested placement days rather than hours ago. I walked among the graves, reading names and dates, looking for patterns in when burials had stopped. The most recent headstone I could find was dated 2001. Walter Harrison Gray, the man whose death certificate I had seen in the library records. After him, nothing. No burials for more than 2 decades in a community that had supposedly still contained hundreds of residents for several years after his death. But there was something else, something that made me stop walking and start photographing headstones systematically, documenting names and dates, building a database that would take me hours to fully analyse, but whose pattern became apparent even before I left the cemetery. The death rate had been wrong for years before it stopped completely. I pulled up census data on my phone, comparing population numbers to mortality rates. Coldwell's population in 1990 had been approximately 550. In a normal population distribution, you would expect roughly 10 deaths per year for a community that size. Maybe less in good years, maybe more in years when flu or accidents skewed the numbers, but roughly 10 per year as an average. I counted graves from 1990 forward. The number was too low, way too low. Only 4 or 5 graves per year through the mid-90s, then dropping further. 2 graves in 1998, 1 in 1999, 1 in 2000, 1 in 2001, then nothing. The population was dying at roughly half the expected rate, then declining further until mortality ceased entirely. This suggested either Coldwell had achieved medical miracles that allowed its residents to live far longer than normal human lifespan, or people were dying and not being buried here, or people were leaving and their departure was being recorded as death to maintain proper bookkeeping, or something else was happening, something that required removing people without creating the paper trail that death normally generates. I drove back to the library and spent the afternoon expanding my research beyond Coldwell itself. I looked at surrounding towns, every community within a 100-mile radius. I accessed census data, population trends, demographic changes over the past 30 years, and I found the pattern that made everything more disturbing rather than less. Every town within this radius showed small consistent population decreases over the past 20 years. Not dramatic, not enough to trigger economic concern or news coverage, just a slow erosion. 3 people 1 year, 5 the next, 2 the year after, 7 the year following. Numbers so small they looked like normal rural attrition. Individually, the losses were unremarkable. Deaths that exceeded births. Young people moving to cities for better opportunities. Farms consolidating, requiring fewer workers. Mines closing, eliminating jobs. The normal death spiral of rural America playing out in slow motion. But when I added them up, when I calculated the total population loss across all surrounding communities over the 20-year period from 1998 through 2018, the number was precise: 493 people. The exact population of Caldwell in 2000, the year census records stopped counting residents. This could not be coincidence. The probability of random population fluctuations in 20 different communities adding up to precisely the population of one specific town was astronomical. This was intentional. This was planned. This was systematic extraction. I cross-referenced the losses, looking for patterns in demographics. I accessed every database available through public records requests and open source intelligence gathering. I looked for commonalities in age, gender, occupation, family structure. I found one commonality that appeared in every case I could document. Every individual who disappeared from surrounding town records over this period had no close family. Never married or widowed with no children. No siblings or siblings who had moved away decades earlier. Parents deceased. No nieces or nephews in regular contact. People who existed in their communities but whose absence would not create immediate concern or investigation. People who could vanish without leaving social holes too obvious to ignore. The record showed them moving away, perfectly documented departures, forwarding addresses filed with post offices, utility accounts closed with final bills paid, property sold or transferred through proper legal channels, everything handled correctly, everything following established procedures, everything completely routine and unremarkable, except I could not find where they had moved to. Forwarding addresses led to P.O. boxes that were closed within months of being established. Property sales went to holding companies that dissolved shortly after transactions completed. Credit histories ended abruptly. Bank accounts closed. Social media profiles, when they existed, went silent. These people had been extracted from their communities through perfectly legal channels, and then simply ceased to exist in any meaningful way, not all at once, not in numbers that would attract attention. Gradually, over 20 years, 1 or 2 per town per year, carefully managed to avoid notice, spread across enough communities that no single location showed alarming trends. Each individual departure documented in ways that suggested normal life transitions rather than coordinated removal. I made a map on paper marking every town that had lost population matching Caldwell's required demographics. They formed a perfect circle around Caldwell, like ripples from a stone dropped in still water, like a pattern of extraction radiating from a central point, like something drawing resources from surrounding areas to feed a central purpose, and at the centre of this circle, Caldwell itself, empty, maintained, functional, waiting. Chapter 7. Understanding the Exchange. I did not sleep at all the second night. I sat in my car with the map spread across my dashboard, a detailed drawing I had created showing every community that had contributed to Caldwell's missing population. Lines connecting outlying towns to the central point. Numbers indicating how many people each community had lost. Dates showing when the process had begun and when it had apparently completed. And I understood something that made me question whether I should drive away immediately or whether leaving was even an option anymore. Something that transformed my understanding of what Coldwell actually was and what it represented. This was not relocation. This was not emergency housing. See, this was not even abandonment followed by strategic repurposing. This was replacement. Systematic, carefully planned replacement occurring so gradually that it had been invisible to everyone except someone who happened to look at exactly the right combination of data points. Coldwell had not been emptied, it had been prepared. The population had been carefully removed over 2 decades through a process so gradual and so perfectly documented that it appeared completely natural. People moved away for normal reasons. People died from normal causes. People disappeared into normal bureaucratic processes that require no special explanation because they happen every day across America. But they had been selected, chosen specifically because their absence would not create obvious voids, because they could be removed without triggering investigations or concerns, because they existed at the margins of their communities, connected enough to contribute to society, but not connected enough that their departure would destabilize social networks. And somewhere, somehow, they had been replaced in the surrounding communities. New people who filled similar roles, who took over abandoned properties, who slipped into social structures without creating disruption, who existed in exactly the same marginal way as the people they had replaced, connected enough to function, but not connected enough to be examined closely. The surrounding towns had not actually lost population in any meaningful way. They had experienced exchange, old residents removed, new residents installed, the total population remaining stable enough to avoid notice. Census numbers might show small fluctuations, but the functional size of communities remained constant. This was sustainable farming of human populations. Harvest from the edges, where loss goes unnoticed. Replace with something similar enough to maintain the appearance of continuity. Repeat across enough communities that no single location shows catastrophic change. I thought about the maintenance patterns I had observed in Coldwell, the rotational care, the systematic approach, the coffee mug that was warm but not hot, suggesting someone had been present recently but was not present now. The buildings that were clean but not pristine, suggesting regular attention but not constant occupation. Someone was here, not constantly, not obviously, but regularly enough to keep systems functional, regularly enough to maintain the appearance of a ready-to-occupy community, regularly enough to ensure that everything worked when it would eventually be needed. But why? Emergency housing does not require this level of active maintenance. Strategic reserves are mothballed, sealed, preserved in static states that minimize degradation. You do not actively maintain emergency housing. You weatherproof it, seal it, and check it periodically to ensure it has not deteriorated. You do not sweep floors weekly. You do not keep coffee makers warm. You do not rotate which sections receive detailed attention. This was something different. This was active study. The thought arrived fully formed, and once it appeared in my consciousness, I could not dismiss it. Coldwell was not being maintained for future human use. It was being studied. Every building was a specimen. Every street a controlled environment. Every system a subject of ongoing observation. Someone was learning how human communities function by maintaining one without humans present. Understanding infrastructure in isolation from the beings who normally use it. Social organization examined without the complication of actual social beings. Resource distribution studied without the interference of resource consumers. All the systems we build to sustain collective life, isolated and examined like a laboratory culture, like bacteria grown on agar plates, like cells examined under microscopes. Like anything we study, by removing it from its natural context and placing it in controlled conditions where variables can be manipulated and effects can be measured. Coldwell was a laboratory, and somewhere, something was conducting experiments. Chapter 8. The purpose reveals itself. I went back into the town hall on the third morning, not to investigate broadly, to confirm something specific. I needed to see something I suspected existed, and I knew approximately where it would be located if my understanding was correct. I found it in the basement, access through a door marked Utilities Authorized Personnel Only. The door was unlocked, which by this point did not surprise me. Security in Coldwell was performative, creating the appearance of restricted access without actually restricting anything. Locks that could be defeated, doors that opened easily, systems that invited exploration, while simultaneously suggesting it was prohibited. The basement was exactly what you would expect in a municipal building. Mechanical systems humming with steady operation, water heaters maintaining temperature, electrical panels with breakers arranged in neat rows, HVAC equipment pushing air through ductwork. Everything functional, everything necessary, everything completely mundane. But in the back corner, partially hidden behind a boiler that radiated heat into the already warm space, was a door that looked different from every other door in the building. Newer, metal instead of wood. With a keypad lock that glowed softly blue, its LED display showing it was powered and active and waiting for the correct code. The door was unmarked. No sign indicating what lay beyond. No warning labels. No utility designation. Just blank metal and a sophisticated lock that suggested whatever was behind this door was meant to remain secure in a way that nothing else in Coldwell was secured. I did not try to open it. I did not touch the keypad. I did not attempt any of the obvious codes that people use when they want to create security theatre without actual security. I simply stood in front of the door for several minutes, understanding what it represented. This was the access point, the place where whoever was maintaining Coldwell entered and exited, the place where observations were recorded and data was collected, the place where the actual purpose of this location was managed. Behind this door was probably equipment, computers, monitoring systems, data storage, communication infrastructure, all the technology necessary to maintain and study a town from a single, secure location. All the systems required to keep Coldwell functioning while documenting how it functioned. I took a photograph of the door with my phone, framing it carefully to show the keypad, the metal construction, the seamless installation in a wall that had clearly been modified to accommodate it. Evidence that this door was not original to the building, that it had been added later, that it represented purpose beyond the municipal government functions that had originally designed this space. Then I left quickly, climbing the stairs two at a time, suddenly aware that photographing the door might have triggered alerts, might have activated monitoring systems, might have announced my presence to whoever checked these systems. Outside, the morning was bright and cold, one of those spring days in Montana where sunlight provides visibility but no warmth. I walked quickly to my car, moving with purpose but not panic, trying to project the appearance of someone completing routine work rather than someone who had just discovered something they were not supposed to see. I got in my car, started the engine, checked my mirrors out of habit developed during driver's education decades ago, And that was when I saw it. Movement in a window, third floor of a building across the street from the town hall. Just a shadow shifting behind glass, too brief to identify details, too deliberate to be random reflection or bird movement or any of the natural explanations that would make it innocent. Someone was watching me. Someone had been watching me the entire time I had been in Coldwell. Someone had observed my investigation, tracked my movements, documented my presence. Not surprising in retrospect. I had been in Coldwell for nearly 3 days. I had broken into buildings. I had examined records. I had photographed evidence. I had spent hours in the library and the cemetery documenting patterns that were clearly meant to remain undocumented. Of course someone would notice. Of course someone would respond. Of course someone would monitor what I was doing. The question was not whether I was being watched. The question was what whoever was watching would do about it. I pulled out of the parking lot at a normal speed, not fleeing but not lingering either. I drove down Main Street, following the same route I had taken when arriving, back toward the highway, back towards civilization and normalcy, and the comfortable ignorance that comes from not asking questions nobody wants answered. I made it 15 miles before I noticed the car behind me. It was not following closely. It was not obvious. It was maintaining distance, staying back far enough that most drivers would not notice, or would assume it was simply another traveller heading in the same direction on a road that offered limited route choices. But I noticed because I was looking for it, because I expected it, because I understood that leaving Coldwell did not mean leaving behind whatever Coldwell represented. The car was a dark sedan, generic model. No distinguishing features visible from this distance. It maintained exactly the same speed I maintained regardless of whether I was driving at the posted limit or 10 miles above it. I tested this 3 times over the next 20 miles, slowing to 55 when the limit was 65. The car behind me slowed, accelerating to 75. The car matched, varying speed randomly between 60 and 70. The car maintained consistent distance. I was not imagining it. I was not paranoid. I was being tracked, not threatened, not stopped, just tracked. As if someone wanted me to know they were aware of my presence, aware of my departure, aware of everything I had done and everywhere I had gone. The car followed for 90 miles, following Highway 41 as it transitioned from high desert to agricultural land to the outskirts of actual civilization. Following through several small towns where they could have stopped or turned off if they had legitimate business in the area, following with the kind of persistence that made it clear this was not coincidence and not normal travel. Then at a junction where Highway 41 met a larger state route where traffic increased and anonymity became possible, the car turned off without signal or acknowledgement. One moment it was there in my mirrors, the next it was gone, having taken an exit that led to a secondary road that went nowhere I could identify on my map. Gone as simply as it had appeared. Message delivered. Point made. Warning issued. I did not stop driving until I reached my apartment 8 hours later, pulling into my parking space as evening fell, sitting in the car for several minutes before I could convince myself to get out and walk to my door like a normal person returning from a normal business trip. Chapter 9. The moment of personal recognition. I filed my report exactly as instructed. Infrastructure functional. Water and electrical systems operating within normal parameters. Maintenance adequate for preservation purposes. No unauthorized usage observed. Recommend continued monitoring on routine schedule. Everything factual. Everything carefully phrased to suggest normalcy without actually lying. I wrote exactly what was expected and submitted it through proper channels, uploading it to the agency database, where it would be filed and forgotten alongside thousands of other compliance reports. Gerald accepted the report without comment. No follow-up questions, no requests for clarification, no acknowledgement that our phone conversation had occurred or that I had raised concerns about the assignment. Just a brief email. Report received, Coldwell file closed, next assignment, rest stop facilities on Interstate 90 between mile markers 210 and 235. Due date, end of month. I returned to normal assignments, highway rest stops, municipal water systems, electrical grid compliance, everything routine, everything boring, everything safe. I processed paperwork and filed reports and attended meetings and did everything my job required with the same steady competence that had characterized my career before Coldwell. 3 weeks passed. Normal weeks, unremarkable weeks, weeks where nothing happened that would make you think your life had been fundamentally altered by seeing things you were not supposed to see. Then I received mail that made me stop breathing for several seconds. I do not get many physical mail pieces anymore. Most of my accounts are paperless, configured to send bills and statements electronically, rather than generating physical documents that require stamps and envelopes and trips to mailboxes. But this arrived by postal service, addressed to me at my apartment, marked as a notification of service establishment, printed on official letterhead, with account numbers and service dates and all the bureaucratic trappings of legitimate utility communication. It was from Coldwell Municipal Utilities. The document was professionally printed, not photocopied or generated from a low-quality printer. High-quality paper stock, official logo, barcodes for automated processing, everything suggesting legitimate origin from an operating utility company rather than from a government contractor managing infrastructure in an empty town. The bill showed an account opened in my name for a residential address in Coldwell. Lot 17, Cedar Street. Service establishment date listed as June 1st, 3 months in the future from when I received this document. No charges yet, just a notification that utilities including water, electrical, gas and sewage would be available when needed. Welcome message thanking me for choosing Coldwell as my home. Contact information for customer service. Everything you would receive when moving to a new community and establishing utility accounts for the first time. I had never requested this. I had never provided my information to any Coldwell system. I had never expressed interest in moving there or establishing residence or connecting to municipal services. But there it was, official and documented, a residence assigned and waiting for me in a town I had visited 3 weeks ago and never intended to see again. I checked the address using satellite imagery, accessing Google Maps and navigating to Cedar Street, finding Lot 17 among the neat grid of residential properties. It was a small house with blue siding and a white front porch, single story, modest size, well maintained based on the satellite image, which was dated from the previous summer. Lawn mowed, roof intact, windows clean, a house waiting for occupation, a house that apparently had my name associated with it in utility databases. I called the customer service number printed on the utility bill. The number rang twice before connecting to an automated system with a professional, recorded voice. "Thank you for contacting Coldwell Municipal Utilities," the voice said, gender neutral and carefully enunciated. "Your service establishment has been confirmed for June 1st at Lot 17 Cedar Street. If you need to modify your move-in date, please visit our office at 23 Main Street during normal business hours, Monday through Friday, 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. Otherwise, your utilities will be activated automatically on your scheduled date. Thank you for choosing Coldwell. The line disconnected before I could respond. No menu options, no way to reach a human operator, no method to indicate that this account establishment was an error and should be cancelled. I tried calling back. Same recording, same limited options, same disconnection after the message completed. I tried different times of day, thinking perhaps outside business hours triggered the automated system, while business hours would provide human assistance. Same recording every time. I tried the alternative number listed for technical support. Different recording. Coldwell Municipal Utilities Technical Support. If you're experiencing service issues, please call back during your scheduled service dates. Thank you. No way to cancel. No way to dispute. No way to explain that this was an error, that I had not requested service, that I did not intend to move to Coldwell in June or any other time. Except it was not an error. I knew that immediately, the same way I had known that the warm coffee mug was not accidental, the same way I had known that being followed for 90 miles was not coincidence. This was a message, a notification that I had been noticed and selected and placed into whatever process Coldwell represented. My name was in the system, my residence was assigned, my move-in date was scheduled, and somewhere something was preparing for my arrival. Chapter 10. The choice that isn't a choice. I went to Gerald's office the next morning, carrying the utility bill in a folder, treating it like evidence that required proper handling and presentation. I did not bring any conclusions or theories, just the physical evidence of an account I had not opened, hoping that showing him concrete documentation would prompt actual explanation rather than the careful deflection I had received before. I received this, I said, placing the bill on his desk where he could see it without touching it, where he would have to acknowledge its existence. Gerald looked at it without picking it up. His expression did not change, showing the same neutral professional mask he maintained during all business interactions. Coldwell Municipal Utilities. I never opened this account. I never requested service. I never provided my information to their systems. Clerical error, probably. Data from your site visit got entered into their system accidentally. Happens sometimes with automated processes. Names and addresses get cross-referenced incorrectly when you're accessing databases for verification purposes. The service date is 3 months from now. That's not a data entry error. That's planned activation. So contact them and have it cancelled. Customer service should be able to resolve it in a few minutes. I tried. Automated system only. No way to reach anyone who can actually modify accounts. No way to dispute or cancel. Gerald finally picked up the bill, examining it more closely, reading the details printed in small font, looking at account numbers and service dates and contact information. He took perhaps 30 seconds, long enough to read everything thoroughly, then set it down in exactly the same position it had occupied before he picked it up. I'll make a note in your file that you completed the Coldwell assignment and have no ongoing connection to the location. That should resolve any administrative confusion. If they bill you incorrectly, just dispute the charges through normal channels. And if it doesn't, if this is not administrative confusion, then you follow normal channels for disputing incorrect utility charges. File a complaint with the Montana Public Service Commission. Request correction through the utility company's formal appeals process. Standard procedure that applies to any utility billing error. He was being deliberately obtuse, giving me answers that were technically correct but practically useless. I could see it in the careful way he chose his words, in the way he avoided making eye contact for longer than necessary, in the way he had positioned his body slightly turned away from me to suggest this conversation should end soon. Gerald, what is Coldwell actually for, really? Infrastructure maintenance, strategic reserve, emergency housing capacity. We've been over this multiple times. Who establishes utility accounts for people 3 months before they move into strategic reserve housing that's not supposed to have permanent residence? His expression hardened, the professional mask slipping slightly to show irritation beneath. You completed your assignment. You filed your report. Your connection to Coldwell is finished. Let it be finished. Move on to your next assignment. Stop obsessing over a minor billing error. I left his office knowing nothing would be resolved through official channels, knowing that whatever Coldwell was, Gerald either did not know or could not say, and that pressing him further would accomplish nothing except making my continued employment uncertain. I tried researching Coldwell from my apartment, accessing every database available through public records requests and internet searches. Every newspaper archive, every property record system, every census database, every historical society collection. The information was consistent across all sources. 0 population, functioning infrastructure, maintained facilities, no explanation for how these conditions could coexist. I tried contacting newspapers in surrounding towns, calling their offices and asking if they had reported on population changes or notable disappearances over the past 20 years. Most dismissed me politely. A few were curious but unhelpful, explaining that rural population decline was too common to warrant detailed reporting unless it involves something dramatic like factory closures or natural disasters. I called county offices in the region around Coldwell, requesting access to death records and property transfer documents. Most cooperated readily, accustomed to researchers and genealogists making similar requests. But when I tried to cross-reference the people who had supposedly died or moved away, I found nothing. No forwarding addresses that led anywhere real, no death certificates that corresponded to actual burials, no property transfers that connected to active owners. I attempted to locate anyone who had allegedly moved away from these communities in the past 20 years, using social media and online people search services. I found nothing. Either they truly had relocated to normal lives elsewhere under different names, or the documentation of their departure was so complete that no trace remained in any accessible database. The utility bill sat on my kitchen counter, where I had placed it after returning from Gerald's office. I looked at it every day. The service date approached with the inexorable quality of scheduled events that occur regardless of whether anyone wants them to occur. I noticed other changes over the following weeks, small things that individually meant nothing but collectively suggested pattern. My name appeared on a mailing list I had not joined, for a community newsletter from somewhere in eastern Montana. The newsletter discussed local events, municipal improvements, community activities, generic content that could describe any small town. But my name and address were printed on the mailing label, suggesting someone had added me to a distribution list without my knowledge or consent. I received a real estate listing in my mail, an expensive glossy brochure showcasing properties in remote areas of Montana. Farmland, rural homes, properties described as perfect for those seeking peace and privacy away from urban complexity. I had never expressed interest in moving, had never contacted real estate agents, had never searched for property online in ways that would trigger targeted marketing. Yet the brochure arrived, addressed to me specifically, highlighting properties in the same region where Coldwell existed. My spam email folder filled with advertisements for rural lifestyle products, equipment for well maintenance, solar power systems for off-grid living, satellite internet service for remote locations, emergency preparedness supplies, everything you might need if you were planning to live somewhere without conventional infrastructure or community support. None of it was dramatic, none of it was threatening, none of it was overtly connected to Coldwell. It was just accumulation, as if systems were preparing for something, as if infrastructure was being adjusted to accommodate a future that had already been decided, as if my transition from urban life to rural isolation was being facilitated through 1,000 small nudges and adjustments that made rural living seem practical and appealing and inevitable. I began to feel disconnected from my normal life in ways that were subtle but increasingly undeniable. Conversations with co-workers felt more difficult, as if we were speaking slightly different languages or operating with slightly different assumptions about reality. Social connections felt more tenuous, as if the bonds that had seemed solid were actually fragile threads that could break with minimal stress. I began forgetting details about people I had known for years. Names required conscious effort to recall. Shared histories became fuzzy, requiring prompting to remember clearly. Inside jokes lost their context, leaving me confused about why something had seemed funny. It was like experiencing mild cognitive decline, except it was selective, affecting only my connections to other people while leaving other mental functions completely intact. It could have been stress, it could have been depression, it could have been normal cognitive changes that happen to everyone as they age, but it felt like something else. It felt like being carefully extracted from a social network, like having ties systematically weakened until disconnection would seem natural when it occurred, like being prepared for isolation by making isolation feel normal and acceptable and even desirable. The service date on my utility bill was now 6 weeks away, then 4 weeks, then 2 weeks, time continuing its forward progress regardless of whether I wanted it to stop. I considered going to the police, but what would I report? That I received a utility bill I had not requested? That I felt disconnected from people? That a town I had visited for work seemed strange? None of this constituted a crime. None of this would prompt investigation. I would sound paranoid, possibly mentally unstable, certainly not credible enough to warrant official attention. I considered going public, posting my findings online, sharing the patterns I had documented, but what good would that do? I had no proof, just correlation. Just coincidence elevated to pattern through interpretation that others might not share. Just the observations of someone who had spent too much time thinking about something that probably had a simple explanation I had failed to consider. I considered fleeing, leaving my apartment, quitting my job, moving somewhere far from Montana and Coldwell and whatever Coldwell represented. But where would I go that the systems could not follow? If they could establish utility accounts in my name without my knowledge, they could presumably track me wherever I went. If they wanted to find me, they would find me. Running would accomplish nothing except making me look guilty of something I had not done and could not articulate. So I did nothing. I continued working. I continued living in my apartment. I continued processing infrastructure compliance reports and attending meetings and performing all the normal functions of someone whose life had not been fundamentally altered by discovering something they were not supposed to understand. And I waited for June 1st to arrive. Epilogue. Why no one sees UFOs. People ask why we have never had definitive proof of alien contact. Why, with all our cameras and sensors and satellites, and billions of network devices capable of capturing and sharing evidence, we have never documented undeniable proof of visitors from elsewhere in the universe. Why every supposed encounter remains ambiguous, every photograph blurry, every piece of evidence ultimately explainable through conventional means, if you are willing to make reasonable assumptions about prosaic causes. They assume aliens would arrive the way we imagine arrival, spacecraft descending from the sky in full view of population centres, landing zones marked by scorched earth and unusual radiation. Dramatic revelation that forces immediate acknowledgement. First contact performed as public spectacle, impossible to deny or explain away. They assume contact would be visual and obvious and undeniable because that is how we would do it, because that is how our science fiction has taught us to expect it. Because anything less than dramatic revelation seems like a waste of the enormous effort required to cross interstellar space. But what if contact does not work that way? What if beings capable of crossing interstellar distances are also capable of patience that exceeds our ability to comprehend? What if they learned to avoid the drama and risk of visible arrival by simply making room? By preparing spaces for themselves without triggering the alarms that visible arrival would inevitably create? Not through invasion, not through conquest, not through any of the violent confrontations that our fiction has prepared us to expect. Through carefully managed demographic adjustment, through systematic population replacement that occurs so gradually it remains invisible to any observer who is not specifically looking for it with the right analytical tools. Taking individuals who would not be deeply missed because they exist at the margins of social networks. People who are connected enough to function in society, but not connected enough that their absence creates cascading failures in social systems. Placing them elsewhere through documentation that appears completely normal. Filling the gaps they leave with something that functions similarly enough to avoid triggering alarm, with something that speaks the right words and performs the right actions and maintains the right patterns, even if underneath those patterns something fundamentally different is learning how to be human by carefully studying everything humans do. Studying our communities by maintaining them without us, learning how we build and organize and sustain collective life by creating controlled environments where these systems can be observed in isolation. Understanding infrastructure by running it without the complications introduced by actual human users. Learning social organization by maintaining spaces designed for social interaction without the interference of actual social beings. Not landing in ways we would notice, inhabiting spaces we have prepared for them through processes we cannot perceive, one empty space at a time, one replaced individual at a time, one community prepared and waiting at a time. We keep watching the sky for dramatic appearances, for craft and beings and clear proof that cannot be explained away through conventional means. We keep waiting for arrival to look like we imagine arrival should look, for contact to occur through channels that our expectations have prepared us to recognize. We keep building detection systems and scanning radio frequencies and searching for signals that match our assumptions about how communication should occur. We never notice the towns that empty gradually through processes that appear completely normal. The people who disappear into routine administrative procedures that require no special explanation. The places that continue functioning without population, maintained by systems we assume are automated but might be something else entirely. The utility bills that arrive for residences we never requested, announcing futures we never chose. We never notice because the process is designed not to be noticed, because it happens beneath the level of obvious disruption, in the gaps between census counts, through administrative procedures that seem routine because they use all the correct forms and follow all the proper protocols, because by the time you understand what is happening, you are already part of what is being studied, your name already entered into systems you did not access, your future already planned by processes you cannot influence. I think about Coldwell constantly. During the day when I should be working, at night when I should be sleeping, every quiet moment when my mind is not occupied with immediate demands. I think about the empty houses waiting in their neat grid pattern, the systems running efficiently without purpose, the patterns of careful maintenance that suggests someone is preparing something for eventual use. I think about my name in a database assigned to Lot 17 on Cedar Street, about utilities scheduled to activate on June 1st, whether I am there to use them or not, about the complete absence of choice in a process that presents itself as voluntary but offers no method of declining participation. And I think about how many other Coldwells might exist scattered across remote areas of America and Canada and perhaps other countries with large empty spaces where towns could be prepared without drawing attention. How many other empty places waiting to be filled? How many other people receiving utility bills for locations they never chose, having their social connections slowly weakened, feeling themselves pulled toward futures they did not plan? I look at missing person statistics sometimes, late at night when I cannot sleep. Not the dramatic cases that generate news coverage and public concern. Not the ones involving children or famous people or circumstances that suggest foul play. Just the routine disappearances that happen every day. People who moved away without providing forwarding addresses. People whose contacts gradually stopped hearing from them. People who left normal lives through completely documented channels and then simply stopped existing in any findable way. The numbers are larger than you would think, large enough to suggest something more than normal attrition from population movement and mortality. Large enough to suggest systematic extraction occurring at scales that would be visible if anyone compiled the data and looked for patterns across sufficient geographic and temporal ranges. We keep looking to the sky for visitors, scanning radio frequencies for signals, building larger telescopes, designing better detection systems, searching for evidence among the stars while ignoring the evidence on the ground, expecting arrival to be obvious while missing the preparation that makes arrival unnecessary because the spaces are already prepared and waiting. We never look at the empty spaces being prepared right here on Earth, the places quietly waiting for occupation by something that has learned enough about human communities to fill them without obvious disruption, the communities that function perfectly well without anyone living there because someone or something has studied them thoroughly enough to maintain them in the absence of their original populations. The service date on my utility bill is tomorrow. I do not know if I will go. I do not know if I have a choice. I do not know if choosing matters when the infrastructure has already been established and the space has already been allocated and the systems have already incorporated your existence into their planning. But I know Coldwell is waiting, with clean streets and functioning systems and a small house on Cedar Street that has my name associated with it in databases I never accessed. I know that somewhere in those carefully maintained buildings there is a space that has been prepared specifically for me to occupy. And I know I'm not the only one. Somewhere right now, at this exact moment, other people are receiving similar notifications. Other lives are being gently disconnected from their social contexts. Other spaces are being prepared in places that appear on maps but contain no population according to official records. We are not being invaded in any way our fiction prepared us to expect. We are being relocated, one person at a time, one empty town at a time, so gradually and so carefully that we do not notice the pattern until we are already part of it. And by then, noticing changes nothing, because the systems have already incorporated us. The accounts have already been established. The dates have already been scheduled. The spaces have already been prepared. The only choice remaining is whether to go willingly or to be collected eventually when the timeline requires it, and the systems detect that you have failed to arrive at your scheduled location on your scheduled date. The towns are waiting. The infrastructure is ready. The utilities will activate tomorrow, whether I flip the switches or not. And we keep looking to the sky, searching for visitors who have been here all along, who are studying us by maintaining our spaces, who are preparing for something we do not yet understand by gradually making room. One empty census at a time. One replaced individual at a time. One community prepared and waiting at a time. Until there are enough spaces prepared. Until there are enough individuals replaced. Until the transition is complete. And whatever has been studying us is ready to reveal itself, or does not need to reveal itself because it has already become us in ways we cannot distinguish from what we were before. I leave for Coldwell in the morning. I do not know what I will find there. I do not know if I will return. I do not know if return is even a possibility once you arrive in a place designed for study rather than habitation. But I know the utilities activate at 8 a.m. I know my residence is prepared. I know my name is in the system. And I know that somewhere, something is waiting to see if I arrive on schedule or if I require collection. The choice that was never really a choice at all. Before we begin tonight's investigation, if you're enjoying this content, please consider using your hype points on this video. It helps the channel more than you could possibly know. If you're listening on Spotify, leaving a review makes a tremendous difference in helping others discover these stories. And if you'd like, drop a comment letting us know what time it is where you are and where in the world you're listening from. We absolutely love seeing where everyone tunes in from across the globe. Finally, if you enjoy this kind of content, please consider subscribing. It means everything to us. Now, let's begin. The quiet signal. A UFO encounter that was never meant to be seen. There are moments in life when the ordinary becomes extraordinary without warning. No fanfare, no dramatic build-up. Just a quiet shift in reality that leaves you questioning everything you thought you understood about the world around you. This is not the story of a believer searching the skies for confirmation. This is not the testimony of someone who spent their nights hoping for contact. This is the account of someone who experienced something impossible during the most mundane moment of their life, in a place where nothing unusual was supposed to happen. What you're about to hear is documented through personal testimony, corroborated sighting reports, and electromagnetic interference logs that were never meant to be connected. This is the story of an encounter that arrived without sound, departed without explanation, and left behind only questions that refused to fade. This is The Quiet Signal. Chapter 1. A Routine That Breaks. The high desert of Nevada holds a particular kind of silence. Not the absence of sound exactly, but a quality of stillness that feels almost deliberate. During the day, the landscape bakes under relentless sun. At night, temperatures plummet, and the darkness becomes so complete that the Milky Way stretches across the sky like a river of light. Marcus Webb had lived on his property outside of Tonopah for 11 years. A former telecommunications technician, he had purchased the 40-acre plot specifically for its isolation. No neighbours within 5 miles, no city lights to pollute the night sky. Just sagebrush, Joshua trees, and the kind of quiet that most people find uncomfortable. Every night, Marcus followed the same routine. Around 10 in the evening, he would walk the perimeter of his property, checking fence lines and ensuring his small flock of chickens had been secured for the night. The walk took approximately 45 minutes. He knew every rock, every dip in the terrain, every angle of the landscape by heart. On the night of October 17th, 2023, Marcus began his walk as usual. The temperature had dropped to the mid-40s. Clear sky. No moon. The kind of night where you could see satellites crossing overhead like slow-moving stars. He had walked this route hundreds of times. He knew exactly how the starlight would catch on the distant mountains. He knew which parts of the fence needed extra attention. He knew the sounds of the desert at night, the occasional rustle of small animals, the distant cry of coyotes. Everything felt normal. The stars were visible in their usual configurations. Orion rising in the east, the Big Dipper hanging low in the north. Marcus wasn't an astronomy enthusiast, but he knew the sky well enough to notice if something was out of place. He was approximately 20 minutes into his walk when the first change occurred. It was subtle, so subtle that he almost didn't register it. The ambient sound of the desert, the faint whisper of wind through sage, the distant insect chirps, all of it stopped. Not gradually, instantly. Marcus paused mid-step, suddenly aware of the absolute silence surrounding him. He had experienced quiet nights before, but this was different. This was the kind of silence that felt heavy, oppressive, like the air itself had thickened. He stood motionless, listening. Nothing. Then he noticed the second anomaly. The wind had stopped completely, not died down, stopped. The sagebrush around him stood perfectly still. In 11 years on this property, Marcus had never experienced a night with zero air movement. There was always some breeze, however faint, moving across the open desert. He felt a pressure building in his ears, similar to the sensation of rapid altitude change. His pulse quickened slightly, though he couldn't identify why. Nothing visible had changed. The stars remained steady overhead. The landscape looked exactly as it should. But something fundamental had shifted in the environment around him. Marcus continued walking, telling himself he was being irrational. Probably a pressure system moving in. Unusual atmospheric conditions, nothing more. He made it another 100 yards before he saw the light. Chapter 2. The First Anomaly. The tar light appeared without warning in the southern sky, roughly 30 degrees above the horizon. It was not bright, not dramatic. In fact, Marcus almost missed it entirely because it resembled a star at first glance. But stars don't appear suddenly. They're either visible or they're not. This light had materialized in a portion of sky that had been empty moments before. Marcus stopped walking and focused on the light. It remained stationary, perfectly still. No blinking, no movement, just a steady, pale amber glow that seemed slightly larger than Venus at its brightest. His first thought was satellite, but satellites move. They cross the sky in steady arcs, taking several minutes to traverse from horizon to horizon. This light wasn't moving at all. His second thought was aircraft, but there was no sound, no engine noise, no navigation lights. Commercial flights often passed over this region, en route between Las Vegas and points north. He was familiar with how they looked. This wasn't that. Could be a drone, he reasoned. Some kind of high-altitude surveillance platform. The military operated out of several installations in Nevada. Unmanned vehicles were common in the area, but drones made noise. Even at significant altitude, you could hear them, and they typically displayed some kind of lighting pattern to maintain FAA compliance. This light was completely silent. Marcus watched it for what he estimated to be 5 minutes, though he later couldn't be certain. Time had begun to feel strange, elastic. Minutes seemed to compress and expand without warning. The light remained absolutely stationary. Then it moved. Not in the way aircraft move, with smooth transitions and predictable trajectories. This movement was instantaneous. The light was in one position, and then, without travelling the distance between, it was in another position, approximately 10 degrees to the east. No acceleration, no blur, just immediate relocation. Marcus felt his stomach, his tighten. Whatever he was looking at, it wasn't operating under normal physics. Objects don't teleport. They move through space in continuous motion. He considered going back to the house, getting his binoculars, maybe his camera, but something stopped him. A strange reluctance to take his eyes off the light, as if looking away might cause him to lose track of it entirely. The pressure in his ears increased. His hands felt cold despite the gloves he was wearing. The light remained in its new position for several more minutes. Then Marcus made a decision that he would later struggle to explain. He started walking directly toward it. Chapter 3. The Light Responds. Marcus moved south across his property, keeping his eyes fixed on the light. The terrain sloped gently downward, leading toward a dry creek bed that marked the southern boundary of his land. As he walked, the light remained stationary. Then, when he was approximately 50 yards from his starting position, it moved again. Same instantaneous relocation. This time shifting back to the west, maintaining roughly the same distance from his position. Marcus stopped. The light stopped. He took several steps to the left. The light adjusted its position, a subtle shift that seemed to compensate for his movement. It was tracking him. Not aggressively, not in a threatening manner, but deliberately, as if maintaining a specific distance and angle relative to his position. Marcus stood completely still, his mind racing through possibilities. Sophisticated drone, military surveillance, some kind of experimental aircraft using technology he wasn't aware of. None of those explanations felt adequate. He raised his right hand slowly, extending it toward the light. Nothing happened for several seconds. Then the light pulsed once, a brief intensification of its luminosity, lasting perhaps half a second. Marcus lowered his hand. The light returned to its steady glow. He raised his hand again. Another pulse, same duration, same intensity. It was responding to him. Marcus felt a wave of disorientation wash over him. This wasn't random. This wasn't coincidence. Whatever was generating that light was aware of his presence and was reacting to his actions. he began to feel something else. Not fear exactly, more like profound confusion mixed with a strange sense of anticipation, as if some part of his mind recognized what was happening, even though his conscious thoughts couldn't process it. Time continued to behave strangely. He had no idea how long he had been standing there. It could have been minutes or hours. The normal reference points he used to track time, the gradual movement of stars across the sky, the cooling of the night air, all seemed unreliable. Then he noticed the second object. Chapter 4. The second layer. At first, Marcus thought his eyes were playing tricks on him. A dark spot in the sky slightly north of the light, but it wasn't moving. And it wasn't like looking at empty space. He had spent years looking at the night sky. He knew what darkness looked like between stars. This was different. This was an absence, a void, a region where stars that should have been visible simply weren't. As his eyes adjusted, the shape became more defined. It was massive, roughly triangular, or perhaps diamond-shaped. Difficult to determine exact geometry because it was only visible in silhouette, blocking the stars behind it. The object was completely dark. No lights, no surface features visible, just a black mass suspended in the sky. Marcus estimated it to be at least the size of a football field, though without knowing its exact altitude, accurate size calculation was impossible. The amber light he had been watching was positioned at what appeared to be the forward point of this dark mass, not attached exactly, more like hovering several hundred feet in front of it. The light wasn't the object, it was a marker, a reference point, something to draw attention while the actual craft remained nearly invisible against the night sky. Marcus felt his heart rate accelerate. This wasn't a drone. This wasn't any kind of conventional aircraft. This was something else entirely. The dark mass remained perfectly still. No sound, no visible propulsion, no heat shimmer or distortion of the stars around it. He tried to estimate altitude. Based on the angular size and assuming the object was as large as it appeared, it had to be at least 2,000 feet up, maybe higher. At that altitude, any conventional aircraft would be clearly audible. Helicopters, planes, jets, they all generated significant noise that carried for miles across open desert. This made no sound at all. Marcus became aware of a new sensation, a feeling of weight pressing down on him. Not physical pressure, but something else, a presence, the distinct impression that he was being observed with the same intensity he was observing the object. His thoughts began to feel strange, fragmented. Ideas would start and then slip away before reaching completion. He tried to focus on practical concerns, what to do next, whether to document this somehow, but his mind kept drifting. The pressure in his ears intensified until it became almost painful. Then the light began to pulse. Chapter 5. The signal. The pulsing wasn't regular. It wasn't like a beacon or a warning light. The intervals varied. 3 short pulses, then a long pause. 2 pulses, another pause of different duration. A single pulse. Extended pause. Marcus tried to find a pattern, some kind of sequence or code. But if there was structure to it, it remained beyond his ability to decipher. As he watched the pulsing light, something began happening in his mind. Thoughts that didn't feel like his own started emerging. Not words, not voices. Something more fundamental. Concepts, understanding, arriving fully formed without the usual process of reasoning or deduction. He suddenly knew with absolute certainty that the object was not a threat. The knowledge simply appeared in his consciousness, solid and unquestionable. He knew that what he was experiencing was not unique to him, that others had stood in similar places, at similar times watching similar lights, that this had been happening for a very long time. He knew that the object was old, Not ancient in the archaeological sense, but old in a way that made human civilization seem brief and recent. These weren't thoughts he was thinking. They were information being placed directly into his awareness. Fragments of memory began surfacing. Childhood moments he hadn't thought about in decades. The face of his grandmother, who had passed 20 years ago. The specific smell of rain on desert sand. Random, disconnected pieces of his personal history rising to consciousness without prompt. Along with these memories came others that didn't belong to him. Brief flashes of perspective that weren't his own. Looking down at Earth from very high altitude, observing cities of light against dark continents, watching weather systems swirl in accelerated time. Marcus tried to resist the intrusion, but there was nothing to resist against. The information simply flowed into his mind like water finding its level. He became aware of vast distances, scales of space and time that made his entire existence feel like a single breath. The understanding that Earth was one of countless observation points, that contact, when it occurred, was rarely direct, that most encounters were passive, observational, data collection without intervention. The realization struck him that he wasn't experiencing communication. He was experiencing something more like calibration, as if his presence at this specific location and time had created some kind of intersection, a momentary overlap between two entirely different forms of consciousness. The pulsing continued. The pressure in his head intensified until it felt like his skull might crack. Then, without warning, it stopped. Chapter 6. Missing continuity. Marcus became aware of himself gradually, like waking from deep sleep. He was sitting on the ground. He had no memory of sitting down. The sky had changed. The stars had rotated. Orion, which had been rising in the east when he started his walk, was now high overhead. The Big Dipper had shifted significantly in its position. Hours had passed. Marcus looked at his watch. The digital display read 2:15 in the morning. Impossible. He had started his walk at 10. Even accounting for the time he had spent observing the light, it couldn't be past midnight. An hour, maybe 90 minutes at most. Over 4 hours had elapsed. He looked up. The sky was empty. No light, no dark mass, nothing but stars and the faint glow of the Milky Way. The silence had ended. He could hear wind moving through the sage again, distant coyotes calling, the normal sounds of the desert at night. Marcus stood slowly. His legs felt stiff, as if he'd been sitting in the same position for a long time. His hands were numb with cold. He was approximately 300 yards from where he had first seen the light. He had no memory of walking this far. The ground around him was covered in dew. His clothing was damp. The moisture suggested he had been motionless for hours while condensation formed on the fabric. He tried to reconstruct the missing time. After the pulsing stopped, what happened next? Had he watched the object depart? Had it simply vanished? When did he sit down? Why did he sit down? The memories refused to form. There was a clear before, the period of observation, and the strange information flowing into his mind. And there was a clear after, the moment of regaining awareness, sitting on cold ground. But the transition between those states was gone, erased, a clean gap in continuity. Marcus felt a wave of nausea. He bent forward. Hands on his knees, breathing slowly until the sensation passed. When he straightened up, he noticed something else. His phone was in his hand. He didn't remember taking it out of his pocket. The screen was on, displaying the camera app. According to the timestamp, the app had been active for over 2 hours, but there were no photos in his gallery, no videos. The camera had been running, aimed at nothing, saving nothing. Marcus turned off the phone and put it back in his pocket. He began walking back toward his house, moving carefully across the uneven terrain. Every few steps he would stop and look up, scanning the sky for any sign of the light or the dark mass. Nothing, just stars and empty space. By the time he reached his house, the eastern horizon was beginning to show the first pale hints of dawn. He had lost an entire night. Chapter 7. The After Effects. Marcus spent the following day in a state of exhausted confusion. He had slept for perhaps 2 hours, fitful and interrupted by dreams he couldn't quite remember upon waking. He tried to approach the experience rationally. He sat at his kitchen table with a notebook and attempted to document everything he could recall. The timeline, the observations, the sensations. But when he tried to describe the period when information had been flowing into his mind, he found the memories slippery, like trying to remember a dream that fades the moment you try to articulate it. He knew things had been communicated. He knew he had understood something profound, but the specific content refused to solidify into language. Over the next several days, Marcus noticed other changes. His digital watch stopped working. The display would glitch, showing impossible times or strings of random numbers. He replaced the battery twice before finally accepting the device was malfunctioning beyond repair. His laptop experienced similar issues. Random crashes, programs opening on their own, the Wi-Fi connection dropping repeatedly despite his router showing full functionality. The problems were brief, lasting only about a week before electronic devices began functioning normally again. But during that period, technology seemed unreliable in ways that defied simple explanation. His sleep became irregular. Not insomnia exactly, but a disruption of his normal patterns. He would feel exhausted at odd hours, wide awake when he should have been tired. His circadian rhythm had been knocked off balance. Certain sounds began causing strong reactions. The hum of electrical transformers, the specific frequency of wind moving across power lines, high-pitched tones at the edge of hearing. These sounds would trigger brief moments of vertigo and the sensation of being watched. Marcus told no one about the encounter, not because he feared ridicule. He had lived long enough to be indifferent to others' opinions, but because discussing it felt wrong somehow, like talking about it would diminish the experience or invite attention he didn't want. There was also the matter of what he would say. How do you describe missing time? How do you explain knowledge that appeared in your mind without source? How do you convey the certainty that you were observed by something utterly foreign to human experience? He continued his nightly walks, following the same route. Part of him hoped for a repeat encounter. Part of him dreaded it. The sky remained normal. Stars, satellites, occasional aircraft with their blinking navigation lights. Nothing unusual appeared, but the sense remained that something unfinished had occurred. As if the encounter on October 17th had been an introduction, not a conclusion. 3 weeks passed before Marcus discovered he wasn't alone in what he had experienced. Chapter 8. Subtle Confirmations. Marcus made the discovery by accident. He had driven into Tonopah for supplies, stopping at the small general store that served the rural community. While waiting in line, he overheard 2 local ranchers talking. One was describing interference with his radio equipment. Multiple nights over the past month, strange patterns of static that would last for hours and then suddenly stop. The other mentioned his wife had seen unusual lights south of their property. Wouldn't talk much about it. Seemed disturbed by the experience. Marcus didn't interrupt the conversation, but afterward, he began paying attention to local talk with new interest. A comment from a gas station attendant about her dog refusing to go outside for 3 nights straight, just standing at the door and whining. A mention in the local weekly newspaper about residents reporting power fluctuations and electronic interference during the second week of October. A post on a regional online forum describing a large dark shape blocking stars observed from a location 30 miles west of Tonopah. None of the accounts were detailed, none explicitly described the same event Marcus had experienced. But there were consistent elements: silence during the encounters, a sense of time distortion, electronic interference in the days following, and notably, a reluctance to discuss the experiences in detail. Marcus began researching historical reports from the area. Tonopah had a long association with military testing and unusual aerial phenomena. The region had been used for classified aircraft development for decades, but the sightings he was finding didn't match standard explanations of experimental aircraft. The descriptions were too consistent across too many years. Lights that responded to observers, objects that moved in physically impossible ways, encounters that left witnesses confused rather than frightened. He found a reference to a Department of Energy report from 1998 documenting unexplained electromagnetic interference at a monitoring station approximately 40 miles from his property. The interference occurred in irregular patterns over a 3-month period and then ceased completely. No cause was ever determined. He found testimony from a former air traffic controller describing radar contacts that would appear and disappear without explanation. Objects that would accelerate beyond the capability of any known aircraft. The controller had filed reports. Nothing had come of them. He found a letter to the editor in a 1976 issue of the local paper, written by a resident describing an encounter nearly identical to what Marcus had experienced. The letter writer described missing time, electronic disturbances, and a profound sense that they had been observed by something non-human. The accumulated evidence suggested a pattern of activity stretching back decades: periodic encounters, passive observation, minimal interaction, no hostility, no obvious purpose. Marcus realized he was part of something ongoing. Whatever had observed him on October 17th had been observing this region for a very long time. The question wasn't whether the encounters were real, the question was what they meant. Chapter 9. Reframing the encounter. Marcus spent considerable time thinking about frameworks, ways to understand what had happened to him. The popular conception of alien contact involved communication, messages, warning about nuclear weapons or environmental destruction, offers of technology or spiritual enlightenment, dramatic interaction with clear purpose. His experience had been nothing like that. There had been no message, no warning, no attempt at meaningful exchange. Just observation, the collection of data, a momentary intersection between two forms of awareness that operated on completely different scales. He began thinking about his own experience observing wildlife. How many times had he watched birds or rabbits on his property without any desire to interact? He was simply noting their presence, their behaviour, their patterns. Perhaps that was closer to what had happened. Not first contact, not communication, just observation by something that regarded humans the way humans might regard interesting but limited creatures. The thought was humbling and strangely liberating. It suggested the encounters weren't about humanity at all. We weren't the focus. We were simply part of the landscape being observed. The information that had flowed into his mind during the encounter, the sense of vast distances and ancient perspectives, supported this interpretation. Whatever had observed him existed on scales of time and space that made human concerns essentially irrelevant. They weren't here to save us or destroy us or guide us. They were here to watch, to document, to collect data from countless worlds across spans of time humans couldn't comprehend. Most encounters, Marcus now believed, were probably passive, brief overlaps, moments when observation systems became visible to those being observed. The silence made sense in this context. Why would you announce your presence when your purpose was simply to watch? The missing time made sense if the observation involved detailed scanning or data collection. The process might require extended periods. The human mind, unable to process or remember such alien procedures, would simply skip over them, creating gaps, clean breaks in continuity. The electronic interference made sense as a side effect. Technologies designed to operate on entirely different principles might generate electromagnetic signatures that disrupted human electronics as a simple byproduct of their function. Even the reluctance to discuss the encounters made sense. Some part of the human mind recognized these experiences as different from normal reality, set apart, not to be integrated into regular conversation or normal life. Marcus realized he would probably never understand the full purpose of what had happened to him. The gap between human consciousness and whatever intelligence had observed him was too vast, but understanding the purpose wasn't necessary. The encounter had happened. It was real. It had been documented in his memory, in the subtle confirmations he had discovered, in the pattern of similar events stretching across decades. That was enough. Epilogue. The signal remains. 4 months after the encounter, Marcus returned to the location where he had regained awareness, sitting on the cold ground. It was February. Clear night, temperature near freezing. The same profound silence that characterized the high desert in winter. He stood in the exact spot, looking up at the southern sky. Nothing unusual appeared. The stars moved in their normal patterns. A satellite crossed overhead, following its predictable arc from horizon to horizon. Distant aircraft lights blinked in standard navigation patterns. The sky looked completely ordinary. But as Marcus stood there, he felt something. Not presence, not observation, just a faint recognition. As if the location itself remembered what had happened. He thought about all the people who had stood in similar places, looking up at similar skies, experiencing similar encounters, scattered across the world, across decades, perhaps across centuries, all of them returning to normal life, carrying memories of something that refused to fit into standard explanations. All of them knowing they had experienced something real, while lacking the language or framework to fully describe it. Marcus looked up at the stars for a long time. Then he walked back to his house, following the same path he walked every night. The routine had resumed. Life had returned to normal patterns. But something fundamental had changed in how he understood his place in the universe. He was not alone in the cosmos. Earth was not unobserved. Human activity was being documented by intelligences that operated beyond human comprehension. And sometimes, rarely, the watchers became visible, not to communicate, not to intervene, just to remind us that we're seen. The encounter was over. The object had departed. The missing hours would never be recovered, but the signal remained. A quiet certainty that something vast and ancient had taken note of one human being on one night in the Nevada desert, and perhaps in ways he would never understand, was still watching. The stars continued their eternal rotation. The desert maintained its silence, and Marcus Webb carried on with his life, changed by an encounter that was never meant to be understood, only remembered.